Hello, friends, and welcome to the Learning Future podcast. I'm, of course, Louka Parry. It's great to have you back with us. Today, we have a wonderful guest. Her name is Rebecca Winthrop. She is a senior fellow and co-director of the Center for Universal Education at the Brookings Institution. Her research focuses on education globally, with special attention to the skills young people need to thrive in work, life, and as constructive citizens. She has authored numerous articles, reports, books, and book chapters. She's currently writing one at the moment, which we'll hear about. And she has a PhD from Columbia University. What you'll hear in this conversation really is a wonderful education thinker who is positioned in a unique way. Someone that understands both at kind of governmental and intergovernmental levels what might be needed based on her research and the research of the amazing team at the Center for Universal Education. Rebecca, it's great to have you with us.
Lovely to be here, Louka.
I can't wait for this conversation. Based on our pre-chat as well, really exciting. Our first question here always at the Learning Future podcast is, what are you learning right now? What's kind of forefront of your mind in the work that you do and in the life that you live?
In the work that I do and the life that I live.
Well, yeah, just a small question.
Starting backwards. Starting backwards in the life that I live, I have 2 teenage boys.
Oh, that's amazing.
So I am really learning how to apply all the things that I study. And that, just because you know it and you research it doesn't mean it's easy to apply all this know-how in your own personal life. So anyways, that's fun. They're wonderful kids, but they are full of
expanding
life and all sorts of boundaries. So that's one thing in life. In sort of more professional work area, although I have to say that I do cross over in the book that I'm writing. I'm testing out a lot of these strategies on my own kids.
Have to talk about
and half of them that I thought were great, they're like, "Ugh, that's so stupid." Okay, out. It doesn't work. But I've been thinking a lot about and learning a lot about for the book that I'm writing with my colleague Jenny Anderson about how to engage students and keep them engaged as they get older, because kids come to school excited. They love school. They're happy. They're thrilled. It's fun. It's interesting. And have you heard of the Jenkins curve? John Hattie made this. Right. It's great. He asked, he's a teacher, educator, and asked 3,000 teachers across the US, what year do you teach? And do you think how many of your kids love school, your students?
Yeah.
And it just was like, starts high and just.
It's like 100%, I think. Down to
and
year 9s, which was the lowest, if it was 37% or something from memory.
Yeah. And that it tracks so closely with how the student engagement data that I've been looking at and poring over, which is like they start out engaged and like by 3rd grade, it's just sort of like downhill. So I'm learning a lot about, really what is going on, like what's happening.
Wow.
And how can we turn it around?
I'd love us just to talk about that. I think everyone listening can kind of feel this epidemic, be it kind of still the latent impacts of COVID and kind of the impact, lockdowns and that entire human chapter. But also something around the design features that, and this is something that we're really curious about as well, is, what are the features of systems, the features of even learning experiences that actually are less kind of behavior management, compliance oriented, and more kind of motivation design or motivation architecture. And so, you talk a lot about the pedagogical core through your transforming education systems work with David Singh. And I was lucky to be at the launch of that a few years ago in New York City. So it was great to see that happen too. And this idea around that being the center of what a school is for. If sometimes we lose sight of the pedagogical core and we end up focused on maybe, or just like one aspect of it. So the resource aspect. We just go, we're going to like focus on just the learning environment and how aesthetic it is, rather than what's really happening in the kind of confluence of all these factors. So what do you take us into the engagement bit first, and then I think we'll come up to the kind of center for ed, because there's so much going on there too. Yeah. What are you discovering? What do you think's needed, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, I think that teachers and school leaders have a massive job cut out for them, and that it's possible, but just barely. And
Mm,
like you kind of have to be a superhero. And personally, I think all teachers are superheroes,
definitely true.
because they tend like the function they perform in society. They educate the next citizens. They take care of our children. They,
Mm,
you know, they are incredible. Um, but the structure, it's more that the structure in which they're trying to do their work is limiting them at every turn. Um, which is how I got into this whole idea of sort of thinking about transforming systems. But I think disengagement it's a wide mix of things. I mean, stuff that I'm learning, it's a wide mix of things. It happens in all schools everywhere. For this book, we interviewed 100 kids
mm.
in the US, and they're often with their parents, but we also did a nationally representative survey of 80,000 kids.
Wow.
And also a nationally representative survey of their parents with our partner Transcend Education. And all types of schools, the most high-end, expensive, elite private schools that have incredible amenities, you
Mm,
find kids are disengaged there. And also all the way through normal sort of, actually what I often call the sweet spot for schools, where it's heterogeneous, mixed SES,
mhm,
which is where kids often do best, frankly, for many reasons. Disengaged there, also disengagement in sort of the communities that have the least financial resources and maybe the least sort of um, opportunities for enrichment.
mm,
And so it's like an equal opportunity problem.
mm.
Um, the impacts of disengagement, however, we're learning are not felt equally. So it affects all kids.
Interesting.
Kids
Okay.
get disengaged from high income parents, middle class, low income,
Yeah.
any type of ethnic background, girls, boys. Um, And, there's slight variation, certainly in our sample of 80,000 kids, a little minor difference between girls and boys, but not that much. Even
Mhm.
between ethnic background, not that much, very small percentage points. Um, and so it affects every kid, but the impact of when you get disengaged is not felt equally, particularly across socioeconomic status.
Yeah.
Because kids who have parents who have more resources, more time, so often middle class or upper middle class parents, they get second chances.
Right.
They may get disengaged, they may sort of start losing their way, or I don't know if they're losing their way or they're just reacting
Hmm. Hmm.
to a system and making a rational choice, and we lose them along the way.
Yeah. Yeah. Well
As
framed.
a
Good
great
point. Yeah.
author that I like talks about, they didn't lose their way, we lost them along
We
the way.
lost them. Yeah.
Um, and though those kids get second chances through tutoring,
Mm,
through parental intervention, who have time and maybe the literacy skills, right, to track
mhm.
what's going on, or the they their kids go to school in the language they speak so they can interface with the teachers,
Mhm.
and advocate for their kids, or they can move schools to a better fit, right? So there's
Yeah.
all these reasons that the impacts of disengagement are more proportionally felt by kids who don't have those resources, kids who have parents who are working multiple hours, long jobs, who might not speak the language of instruction,
Mm,
a whole wide range of reasons why they don't have the resources to give these second chances. And also oftentimes those kids, if they do start um, getting disengaged, and then you start seeing it in their grades, etc.
yes.
Those parents want those kids to succeed in school, absolutely, but then they often make a choice, right? Like, well, they often need help at home.
Yeah.
They might need to take care of a sick relative
Yeah.
or younger siblings, or, there's just a lot of needs out there. And I think that another thing I'm learning is, which I've known, but again, this research has really brought to the fore, just how much school leaders, educators really, really take the time to figure out what's going on in your kid's life. Do not assume. We talked to so many kids who had these stories and were late, they were doing all this stuff at home and they weren't doing great at school. And then they were acting out and, they were seen as a real problem.
Yeah.
When really they had problems at home.
Yeah.
So anyways, those I could go on for
Interesting.
the entire
Interesting.
podcast.
Okay. Yeah. No. Well, I think there's going to be a few themes that do weave throughout. So this idea that the impacts are not equal, even if we see kind of reflected in the general population data, a lot of similarities. I guess one question I have then is kind of the hypothesis that engagement is the thing that we should focus on. And I mean, I kind of take it as a given, but I guess we should have the conversation, because if I've often reflected on this as soon as I saw the curve, where year nines were, the lowest, and talk about year nine teachers, and everyone goes, "Oh, that group of year nines, we've got a really challenging so often," and then it kind of spikes again as people move through. I wonder how much of that can be attributable to just the prefrontal cortex being reconstructed, i.e., adolescence, and how much of it is system. I mean, I don't even know if we could ever discern that, but I'm just really curious because clearly engagement and self-determination theory and kind of motivation science, I mean, things I'm very curious about, like that I think are way better than compliance-oriented behavior management. Like, oh, you've acted out, you must be punished, rather than it being, go have a detention instead of, okay, restorative justice, for example, which might be way more useful for the school but it's more resource intensive. I'm curious, like, is it the right thing to be targeting? What's your view?
It's a very good question. And I have been working on this book for the last 3 years, and so have been really pouring through a lot of the data, and I am very convinced.
Okay, right.
Because for a couple of things. So there's a couple of things to respond to there because you brought up some really interesting thoughts. So first point, is engagement really an important thing? It's not, of course, the only thing, but is it a really pivotal thing? And I've looked at all the data, and it really is how engaged a child is in their learning, which, by the way, could be in school or out of school.
Yes, right.
Is really the thing that translates between the context they're in, out of school activity, classroom, family environment, and their outcomes, their learning outcomes, learning how to be a good sister or brother, learning how to take care of their neighbor, learning piano, knowing algebra. Like, it is in research terms, the mediator. It is the thing that translates. They're sitting in a classroom, they're sitting in a piano lesson, whatever. They're out with their church group.
Yeah.
Could be anything, really. What are we trying? And we're, adults or their peers are trying to imbibe some type of lesson. It's their level of engagement is what makes it happen and stick. Because engagement is multidimensional. It's it's emotionally, how are they reacting? Because learning actually emotions are very tied to learning. Learning is not just cognitive. This is why I'm not so worried about generative AI just taking over humanity, because we are not just cognitive big brains.
Yes.
We are thinking, feeling. We're thinking, yes, but feeling, and it's very tied to thinking our feelings. So it's how emotionally they're interacting. It's and how they feel in the context. Like if they're sitting in a classroom and they are feeling stereotype threat, like they are the only kid in that classroom that is whatever, you name it. They could be, in the US, let's say they're the only recent immigrant child who doesn't necessarily speak language in a sea of kids who've lived here their whole life and are citizens. If they're sitting there and thinking, I don't belong, oh, how do I feel here? And they're feeling tenuous. It's going to be hard to cognitively engage. We're like really grapple, do the deeper learning cognitive exercises they need to do. And then they may stop sort of doing the things they need to actually make the learning happen, paying attention, taking notes, turning the pages of the book, asking a peer for a question, right? So it's a researchers call it a multi-dimensional construct. So it's kind of all those things wrapped together, which is why it's such a powerful explainer. Anyways, that was my first point, and I totally forgot what
the rest. No, that's absolutely. They'll come back up, but I love this idea, engagement as the mediator, and I mean, because it's an operating assumption, I guess, but I think asking the question is super important, because I think, views where the locus, the responsibility is placed on the student to motivate themselves. And I think there's, and I think the other context is like, it's all the teacher's responsibility to motivate the student, which is also problematic. It's somehow, it's this beautiful, the craft of education.
It's a dual. It's a dual thing. And kids, and really it's also, for any school leader, it's about the environment, a school leader and classroom leader, teacher, and the environment the kids are in. But kids have to come to the table too. But often they're reacting to their environment. That's my second point. To your point about like it goes down. Is it, what's going on in adolescence? Why is there so much disengagement? I mean, they are learning something. They just might, they are learning something. They are deeply engaged in something. It just might not be what we educators want them to learn and be engaged in the right way. At that point. So I think it has less to do with sort of adolescent brain development. Well, actually, I think it very much has something to do with adolescent brain development. My point is, adolescence is a huge time of massive sort of surge in brain development akin to sort of early childhood. Researchers used to think, oh, no, it's just early childhood, and then you kind of pittered along and grew a little bit, but adolescence is huge. And they are firing on all synapses. And I think they certainly are more susceptible to the world around them, to social cues, to their place, their identity. And so if they might be just reacting a lot more to the fact that they are not given in a traditional sort of academic, high school is a lot more about specialization. I mean, plenty of schools do this beautifully. They're just often the exception rather than the norm. So I think it's more to do with that mismatch of what adolescents need, and they do get engaged. Whatever, video games, their girlfriends or boyfriends.
Such dynamic.
Do you know what I mean? What they get engaged in all sorts of things, making art, travel, the best coffee shops, whatever. I don't know. Depends on where they live. Skateboarding, hiking.
It's so true.
World of Warcraft.
It's so true.
Learning and engaged. We just are not providing them enough of this, what they need, I think, in the school, secondary ed years to keep them that engaged.
And I think framing that as behavior problems doesn't seem to really be the solve. I think it's kind of a short-term reaction for our work in education systems, rather than thinking kind of more multidimensionally and almost fractally to go down. Okay, well, what's actually required here? What are the root causes of this so-called problematic behavior? And I learned this as an educator in the Outback, Rebecca, and working, First Nation communities, where, what I was trying to teach, I thought was very engaging and dynamic. And, I'd bring all every ounce of my pedagogical toolkit, the guitars, the singing, dance, whatever. But even so, it wasn't necessarily what the young people wanted to learn at that particular point in time, as I would discover as they potentially walked out of my classroom mid-lesson. So, it's kind of like, it was a real baptism.
That's a bit of humbling experience, I'm sure.
Oh my gosh, man, I was so humbled. Like, I know a few things. I just think it's really, it strikes me still. I think in the context where I've worked and now working alongside schools and systems, governments,
Mm-hmm.
um, less of a researcher, more kind of field work,
Mm-hmm.
convener,
Mm-hmm.
communicator type. But getting opportunities to speak to wonderful people like you. The distinction I think between schooling and learning is one that we
Mm.
conflate all the time. And I almost, in most of my talks, I kind of bring it to the fore. I say, I just want to make a discernment here between
Mm-hmm.
schooling, education, and learning. Learning being an
Mm-hmm.
intrinsic human trait, which
Mm-hmm.
effectively we are born with, much as we're born with a universal grammar for
Mm-hmm.
language acquisition. Schooling is a completely fabricated construct that's useful for our economic and civic
Mm-hmm.
systems. So, and that's what we should be critiquing is the schooling system, not learning processes, because learning is kind of what makes us most human. Um,
Right.
and so I guess this, and the frame that I've heard from a few different theorists, Professor Sandra Milligan at University of Melbourne, it's like we need to kind of
Mm-hmm.
embrace the language of learning and move away from
Mm-hmm.
the grammar of schooling because as you said in the beginning, the invisible parts of our schooling systems are the things that we need to bring into consciousness and reimagine and
Mm-hmm.
redesign, i.e. behavior management processes or,
Mm-hmm.
classroom constructs or simple like an overemphasis on cognition, not paying
Mm-hmm.
attention to the social and the emotional dimensions, which I think really speak to the whole point around adolescence. They care deeply,
Mm-hmm.
more than ever, about the social context. When you're 14 and you're trying to work it all out, where do I fit and who am I?
Mm-hmm.
You care probably less about um, doing some worksheets and way more about
Right.
having
Right.
conversations with your friends, which is what
Right.
we lost during COVID as well, which is
Right.
another kind of enduring impact, I think, of that. So is that so when you think about all the research that you've done and even some of the research that's happening across the whole Center for
Mm.
Universal Education,
Mm-hmm.
like where are you seeing the kind of embracing of that distinction of learning principles being imbued into
Mm-hmm.
the way that we quote unquote school? And I think about the wonderful work you've done on family engagement at
Mm-hmm.
schools, for example, some of your own work on, what we're talking about here, agency,
Mm-hmm.
and then, yeah, you're doing so many different things. I know it's a big reflection, but um, what are you seeing as kind of the emerging paradigm, I guess, for like a new education system or a new
Mm.
school?
Ooh, that's a biggie. Well, first off, I think I like your distinction, and I think it's a useful one between sort of the institution of like school that we have today
Mm-hmm.
and education, which is the practice of education, passing on knowledge and traditions and norms to our young,
Yeah.
which we've had for ever since
Millennia.
humanity existed, and in more formal ways in China and ancient Greece, for thousands of years, and sort of the process of learning, which is humans are hardwired to do and kids are hardwired to do and adults too, but kids are really primed. I think that's helpful. And it gets to one of the things you mentioned about invisible visible, because I've done a lot of work on education innovations over the years, which actually led me to, gosh, how are we really
Mm.
communicating with um, the main stakeholders in this in who are accessing the innovations, which are students and families and parents and educators,
Yeah.
themselves, the people, the main people, stakeholders in the system don't often have a huge voice in how the system is designed
Yes.
and run. So one of the things throughout sort of that learning journey that I've been on is really realizing that so much of what people think school is just inherited. And I think it's true for families and communities, of what they think a good school looks like. And I think it's true for school leaders and educators, like that's how school looked, because that's
Mm-hmm.
how what it looked like when we went to school. And that's how we're doing it now. And this is the bell schedule, and this is our curricular standards, et cetera. And actually, even in policy, you can, you don't have to, you can do a lot
Mm.
to change sort of how a school is organized and run without changing any policy in most countries. And I'll give you a great example. There's this organization that I'm very fond of because I think they're really pushing the envelope and doing great work, called Big Picture Learning.
Yes.
And you know them.
I do
Yes.
know them. They're great. Yeah.
So you should have them on if you haven't already. For your listeners, there are many countries, they started in the US, but basically their high school model. And, I've visited their schools in the US, and they're a nonprofit that helps schools take their model and sort of tweak it. Every school is slightly different. But the gist is, in high school, kids go to school 3 days a week, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, usually, and they do their courses where they are learning. They are doing knowledge acquisition because knowledge is important. You do want kids to know how the world works and what is photosynthesis and, like why the science behind global warming and all sorts of things, and how bills become laws. Like, this is important. Like, it's not, this is an important part of being able to live in the world and be an active citizen and be able to, choose your path, right? But 2 days a week, they apply their knowledge on the job. And what they do is they pair kids choose every semester, they choose an internship where it's a work site in the community. Could be a business, could be a nonprofit, could be their, parents, mosque, whatever. And they work there 2 days a week, and on site they have a mentor, and the teacher calls the mentor and says gives feedback, and then they digest what they learn on the job. So they're applying their knowledge, and they're learning so much about the world and how things work, and they're choosing what to do. And those kids have so much agency. They know how to advocate for themselves. They are engaged. And there's plenty of public schools in the US who are using the big picture learning model. They're a public school with public school teachers and public school funding. Nobody had to pass state laws or get special school board, like they just did it. So a lot of what I think needs to change is just our mindsets, how we think about our work and what is possible and what isn't. Like, a lot of things are probably possible. They just didn't seem possible because no one ever did it that way. Now, some things you do, look, schools also, especially educators, have a lot of stuff that they are required to do. So they have, they're kind of, squeezed from the top and put pressure from the bottom, which is the parents saying, why aren't you doing, a good job? And I will say, family engagement, I was working on lots of education innovations, and there were many innovations, like, it's not in the big picture learning space that I ever ran into, but others like it that ran into parents being really concerned about this innovation because it looked weird. And it wasn't really the parents' fault, because we in the education community don't communicate with families and parents about what good teaching and learning looks like. And so I really realized that is a huge missing piece of being able to change the grammar of schooling. And in fact, there's been lots of studies over the years in the US in particular, I'm thinking of, that has shown that sort of parental norms about what good quality education look like is holding back bigger change. And again, this is not the parents' fault. It's because we in the education system, I put myself in there. I just started. I've been doing education work for 25 years, my whole career. And the last 5-6 years, I'm working on parents. So like, what was I doing the other 20? So I put myself in that camp. It's not something that we train our professionals in the sector to do, how to communicate outside the school walls.
That's so profound. It is absolutely right. And I guess the reflection, it's often the system isn't designed to bring families in easily. It's often designed to keep them in
Yeah.
the off front office. So it's kind of it's kind of beholden sometimes on the educator community, the leaders, to play that role. But you're absolutely right. I mean, this question, like, what does a good education look like? I think it's such a critical question for. I think it is actually a re-education campaign in some ways. I
Yeah.
think because we are just so many of our biases are implicit when it comes to education, and of course, the education of your own children has an even deeper kind of conception of, oh well,
Absolutely.
my kid, and that's
Right.
beautiful because it comes from a loving place, but it can be challenging. I want you to talk a little bit about mindset, Rebecca,
Okay.
because I'm curious to, I think about a dear mutual friend of ours, Tony Mackay, who
Mm,
always says, we are the people that we are waiting for. And it really gets me every time.
I
So
know.
I'm
I
like,
love
oh,
that.
okay, yeah, I need to act and use my agency and my skills now to be that person rather than waiting for the kind of hero fallacy. Um, but I wonder about mindset when we think about, like, what does a good education look like? That's kind
Hmm.
of a mindset consideration, especially some of your work on teacher mindsets, which is, you know, am I an instructor or am I a activator, designer? And I think about some
Hmm.
of John Hattie's work, with whom I
Hmm.
studied at Melbourne University,
Hmm.
an instructional leadership master's. So I kind of
Hmm.
got all the pieces there. But I'm really curious. I think, how one question that I'd like to ask, you know, especially when you employ an educator, is like, how does learning happen? Because asking that
Right.
question reveals
Right.
the assumption as to a
Underneath.
process,
Yeah.
exactly, and the mindset of how they will teach life.
Right.
So what's your
Right.
kind of your reflection on mindset? And obviously, we've got Carol Dweck's work and growth mindsets now. Gosh, 15 years old, perhaps. But
Yeah.
where do you think we're at in the kind of
I
stage?
almost, I wonder if mindsets, I should be more clear because I think what I've learned is it's really about sort of the beliefs we hold. I love your question that
Nice.
you ask educators. How do you think learning happens? What is your beliefs around how this happens? So when we are looking at how do you transform systems, the
Mm.
grammar of schooling, there's many, many fine researchers and theorists have talked about the grammar of schooling. Um, and I have been very influenced by um, a systems thinker named Donella Meadows, who actually came out of the environmental movement. And what I've really learned from her, and she was really talking about like where are the leverage points for system change.
Yeah.
And she said, look, you can spend your life tinkering around. She didn't use these terms, she had opaque terms, but basically sort of the visible elements, excuse me, the visible elements of a system. And that they're important to do. And I would call that systems strengthening. So
Okay.
how do you shift your staffing and hiring and um, you know, promotion? How do you shift your budgets? Like, and those are all things that, even feedback. How do you shift student assessments? Although I
Yeah.
feel like assessments has a particular place in education, but still, how do you shift assessments and feedback loops? And you could do those to really strengthen a system to make it work better, particularly for kids for whom it's not working well. And I think a very large part of our broad global education community, many systems around the world, people are focused on that. And
Yes.
that's good to do. It's not bad to do. It's good to do. But there's another type of thinking, and that's where the system transformation piece happens, which is what's the purpose of education? Who has the power to decide and whose voice is at the table to talk about the purpose of education? And if we agree collectively on a purpose, what would education look like to make sure kids deliver on that purpose? And once you get there,
Mhm.
that is shifting a system, transforming it all together. Um, assuming you come up with something different, which is why you would even do, if you're perfectly happy and it works
Yes.
beautifully for everybody and you're getting all the skills you need, then don't touch it.
That's
Leave
right.
yourself, leave your school, don't mess around with it. Like, but if you are struggling with anything, you might want to go there. And one of the things we've done, and you talked about these 3 Ps, which is, is a broad framework for thinking about transformation, which is really think about the purpose of a system, think about the power dynamics, whose voice is at the table to figure out what that purpose is. And then once you figure that out, you have to align your pedagogical core to it, which is the heart of what happens in education. And that is the pedagogical core, the interaction between an educator, a student, the materials, and any other resources like the curriculum. And a resource could be an online learning platform or something. And it doesn't have to be in a classroom. It could be outside under a tree. It could be in different contexts, but it has to be the interaction between those things. So if you have a curriculum that's new and gets changed and it doesn't change the interaction between that curriculum and the teacher and the student, nothing shifts, it's not going to have an impact. So the pedagogical core, you really have to align that to whatever the purpose is, and then really do that system strengthening to sort of align the different components of the system, which is where an assessment would be helpful that supports what you want to achieve. And, we found we did a lot of research with many colleagues in my team. Emily Morris is one of my close colleagues who I work with on this. Even just asking what's the purpose of education, what does a good quality education look like, to teachers, to parents or caregivers, and to students, and seeing if they're even on the same page. And invariably they're not.
Yes.
We've done this in 14 different countries. They are often not on the same page, including in Australia.
Yeah.
And it is very interesting to see that often it depends a little bit on SES, but often parents and kids are more aligned, and teachers have a different perspective. And when we ask about the purposes of education, it's really fundamental. It's not like, do you want what skills you want to read? It's sort of like, why send your kids to school at all? Is it to help them become better citizens? That's sort of in the education theory. That's one big purpose. Is it to help them go on to higher learning, college or some sort of post-secondary? That's an important purpose. Is it to get a job? Third purpose. Is it self-actualization? Basically, we don't use these fancy terms, but is it to build self-awareness and responsibility and understand myself?
Brilliant.
And I have to say, a lot of parents, it's higher learning, and a lot of teachers, it's sort of, what we would coin social emotional learning and civics.
That's so
and often they don't meet up.
Yeah.
So
that was, I've read the paper, Rebecca, but you've just so beautifully framed, the difference between the visible, the system strengthening, and the invisible, the systems transformation. And that's just, it's really dropped in for me. So thank you very much for that. I'm just on what you've just said too. I think I'd love your reflection on the piece around power, because it still seems to me that the system strengthening piece can is happening with existing
lots of people are doing lots of good work, and it's hard work, and it's not that it's easy. I shouldn't say because it's strengthening, it's easy, right? It's
still
hard,
still different
and important. Yeah,
absolutely. And it's kind of like a split screen view somewhat, what kind of best and next. But I wonder about the power piece, because I guess the hypothesis I hold is that we can't really transform unless we're willing to let go of power. I even think it's at every level, intrapersonal, interpersonal, like organizational, even maybe planetary.
Yeah.
Because I even think, I think the whole notion around being in control, really, if you sit with it long enough, it's kind of never true. Like complex adaptive systems, for example, would tell us that we're actually never really in control. It's just kind of an egoic state.
An illusion.
It's an illusion, but it helps us feel safe in a world that seems desperately out of control, because it's entropy, it's kind of chaos, it's complex, it's evolving, and it's emergent. And so I wonder, when you think about systems transformation and some of the work that we're trying to do here in Australia and with our colleagues, it seems to me that the power shift is a really significant aspect to, not power over, but power with. And so your example of having some students, some parents, and some educators all come together, I think what's also happening there is there's like a kind of a dissolving of the old power structure to say, I teach you listen, or I teach you learn, from one that we're all learning together, we're all redesigning together. What's your reflection on the role of power in trying to get us to the
I think it's really important. And in fact, you were there when we launched this report that outlines these sort of three P's: purpose, pedagogical core, and position, which is aligning the rest of the components of the system behind your pedagogical core. And we had heavy debate and robust discussion inside CUE with many of my colleagues, but also outside, who critiqued us and said, look, who critiqued me and my co-author and said, look, you're missing a fourth P, and it's power. Like and so we've added that back in, and they were right. They were totally right, because the point about defining a purpose, if you can't unilaterally define a new purpose of education. Like we have a current purpose in our we have a current purpose, and the system works. I think you say this too. Like, yes, the system works really well for what it was designed for, which is to sort and rank and see which kids should go on to higher learning and which kids should go off to do other types of roles in society. And that's what it was designed for. And that's what it's doing. Yeah. So if we're not okay with that, and we have evolved over 150 years of universal education, with the idea that every kid should get to go to school, not just a certain few, which is sort of the name why we call the Center for Universal Education, and said, no, actually every kid should be able to have all the options and be able to, leave school able to choose their path. Then we probably have to redesign the purpose of our system. And we can't do that without bringing everyone else with us. That is different, I think, from saying everyone has to play all the roles in a system. I don't think, I think teachers have deep expertise, are professionals, and frankly, I couldn't do their job. It's so hard. Like, it's so hard. And by the way, it's one of the things that will not be automated by ChatGPT. So teaching is the new future, FYI, along with caregiving. So encourage all your kids to go into teaching. They'll be making much more money than coding, for example. Yes. It's not that parents should be teachers, and teachers can't know every kid the way a parent knows. And so it's more the co-creation of a new purpose, and then figuring out what your roles are within that and how you can work together to support that purpose. But I think that co-creation of the purpose is where you have to let go of power. Like there's some beautiful case studies we've done. If you, when you were teaching in the Outback, and maybe you did this, I don't know, let me ask you. When kids left the class you're giving it your all, you're singing them a song, whatever, and they would leave.
Maybe that's why they left, Rebecca.
No, I doubt it.
Yeah.
Like, were you able to sit with them and say, why are you leaving? What's happening? What's different? So we have great case studies of not individual teachers, but districts who've done that with certain kids, certain groups of kids in their district do not show up and engage. And they literally work with the whole community. What's going on? What's happening? And they redesign sort of how they think about their purpose of school in their district. In the US, we have, this is actually Canada, I'm thinking of, with Indigenous community members. And that process of letting them in was transformative, and the kids all of a sudden showed up because it's because they saw themselves in the system, whereas before they didn't. And in actually the 21st century skills and a lot of sort of Indigenous sort of priorities that were put on the table, there was a lot of connection.
Absolutely. Isn't it fascinating? Well, you've taken me back into kind of my brand new
what did you do?
headset. No, well, I mean, tried a lot of different things. I actually think my reflection now, Rebecca, is first point, we always talk about innovation, but I think it's equally remembering what it means to be human, like deep humanity, as well as innovation forwards, outwards, also like a deepening downwards, inwards, into a community level, glocal, which is not a word I like, but that kind of the connection of the two. And in our case, in the Outback, my reflection is we could have done so much more and been and reinvented. We were as a team too wedded to what a school needed to look like. That said, we also won awards for innovation because we initiated men that had come back from men's business. We actually said, okay, well, we're going to create a specific program for you because they weren't going to just roll back up now as men and be taught by technically a boy or a girl, depending on, depending on the cultural framing. And then, so we had to adapt and respond. And, we started to do increasingly bush it. We started to reintroduce first language, as a linguist myself also, back into, because this is the worldview and this is what actually is needed. And if I had my time again, I would have just been like, okay, we would have sat down with the elders, which we did do. And we came up with a bilingual vision for the school when I was the school principal.
Right.
And
so there you are, you're sharing power.
Earlier.
Power. Well, everyone learns on their journey, but that's sharing power.
Yeah. Yeah. And it was precisely that. And at its worst, it was just a Western institution plonked in a community. It's still there, doing some good work. Yeah. But at its best, it was a community school, and it had actually the name of the peoples in the name of the school, Anangu School. And so that at its best, it was fully representative of the desires and the dreams of that community. And so that was my own journey to go on, obviously, as an educator and leader, was to realize, okay, I actually know way less than I think. It's the Dunning-Kruger effect. But it just actually completely set me up to be able to do what I do now, which I think is to challenge some of the implicit assumptions that we all operate on. Back to a piece around mindset, power, beliefs. And I remember seeing, I came across Meadows through your work, and looking at the lever, the places to interfere in the system. And of course, the strongest but hardest to change are the beliefs. What do we believe to be true?
And often you don't need to shift curriculum or assessment to shift beliefs, actually.
Interesting. Well, I feel like there's going to be a pretty big part 2, Rebecca, when we get to it.
All right. It's lovely to talk to you.
I've got a final question.
About your experience in the Outback.
Oh, we could definitely have that conversation. My final question
you should do a whole podcast with some of your old colleagues.
That's an idea for you. That's a great idea.
What did we learn? How many years? That would be so cool. And really seeing how that was formative for you guys and what that led to your own journey.
Gosh, Rebecca, I see why you're as prolific as you are. We've covered some ground. We've covered some really amazing ground in this conversation. I'd love you to leave us with a reflection. What do you want to kind of resonate from all the themes that we've covered and from this kind of moment that we find ourselves in education?
I think my takeaway for myself as a parent, in my work, as someone who studies this work, but works very closely with education system leaders and practitioners in the education community, is we all have more power than we think. We do. We can change things. So that's what I'll leave you with.
Thank you, Rebecca, for joining us today on the Learning Future podcast. Absolutely delightful conversation.
My pleasure.